Hello, good evening and welcome everybody. Welcome to the Rothenberg Hall here at the Huntington for the next in our series of centennial lectures. My name is Steve Hindle. I'm Director of Research here, where I oversee the fellowship program, the conference program and the lecture program. Really delighted to see so many of you here for the Zeidberg Centennial Lecture. As you know, the Huntington celebrates its 100th anniversary this year. It's 100 years since Henry and Arabella Huntington signed the deed of indenture which turned their private collection into a public research institute. And the thinking behind the Centennial Lecture Series was to commemorate that momentous occasion by inviting back to the Huntington experts who had worked in the treasures of our collections and could explain the relevance of those collections to an early 21st century audience. This particular slot in the Centennial Series is named in honor of my friend and former colleague David Zeidberg. The lecture was endowed in 2017 upon the occasion of David's retirement after 21 years service as Avery Director of the Library here at the Huntington. And I'm delighted to say that David is here in the audience this evening. Please join me in recognizing David Zeidberg. The inaugural lecturer in 2018 was Professor Bill Sherman, Director of the Warburg Institute in London, and he was followed last year by Professor Henry Woodhousen, Rector of Lincoln College, Oxford. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the third lecturer in the series, Peter Stallybrass, Annenberg Professor Emeritus in the Humanities and Professor of English and of Comparative Literature and Literary Theory at the University of Pennsylvania. Peter was educated at the University of Sussex, the second best of the new British universities of the 1960s, from where he holds his undergraduate, but not, he is proud to say, his doctoral degree, and where he ultimately became a faculty member and professor. He subsequently taught at Dartmouth College and moved on to Penn in 1988. Peter's research interests are famously very broad. He once described them to me as follows: the history of the book, printing that isn't for books, interactions between printing and writing, erasable paper and the history of writing surfaces, bookmarks and reading practices, filing systems, and marks. Carl, that is, not Groucho. He's published in all these fields, notably The Politics and Poetics of Transgression with Alan White in 1986, Marx, Materiality and Memory, 1999, the prize-winning Renaissance Clothing and the Materials of Memory with Annie Jones, who's also here in the audience this evening, and Benjamin Franklin, Writer and Printer with Jim Green in 2006. He's perhaps best known for his groundbreaking work in the material culture of reading and writing, especially for two essays which appeared in Shakespeare Quarterly on the materiality of Shakespeare's texts and on material texts in Shakespeare's plays. He's held many, many fellowships, including those from the ACLS and the Guggenheim Foundation, and visiting professorships in London, Paris, and Harvard. He was elected to the American Philosophical Society in 2007. In 2011 to 12, my first year in my current post, he held the Avery Distinguished Fellowship here at the Huntington. And one of my friends and colleagues commented at the end of that year, "Steve, you've got no idea how fortunate you were to have Peter Stallybrass in your first cohort of fellows." And I said, "On the contrary, I know exactly how much value he added to the scholarly community." Peter came to the Huntington that year in 2011 to figure out what is a book. That was the title of the research fellowship that he held. But the combined influences of his fellow scholars and our collections sidetracked him, productively, I hope, and he decided that the more pressing question was, what is a letter? And it is on that curiously complex topic that he will be lecturing this evening. To discuss the materiality of love, Elizabeth Barrett, and letter writing, please welcome Professor Peter Stallybrass.
Well, it's really an incredible pleasure to be back here. at the Huntingdon. It was a wonderful year that Annie and I had here. And Steve was just a fabulous person to work with. It was really just an extraordinary period. I have many thanks to him, to Sue Hodgson, to Natalie Serrano, to Juan Gomez, to Catherine Wayroy, I don't know, Miller, who both did the fabulous poster, which I greatly like, but also has been helping out at the doors this evening. So many thanks to Catherine. And finally, to Ben Tuttle, who has done all the electronics. In 1827, the 21-year-old Elizabeth Barrett Barrett, as she then was, she became Elizabeth Barrett Browning later, received a letter from Hugh Stuart Boyd, a Greek scholar and neighbor. Boyd was her father's age, married and with a daughter who was the same age as Barrett herself. Over the next 5 years, Barrett fell passionately in love with Boyd. He was blind, and he needed readers like Barrett, who were proficient in Greek, to read to him. But his blindness also meant that Barrett's letters to him had to be read aloud by his wife and daughter, and that consequently, she could never directly express her love. So she poured out that love into a secret diary that was only published in 1969. By then, the most revealing passages had already been torn out or erased. In the spring of 1832, two catastrophes were impending for Barrett. First, her father, having lost a considerable part of his fortune, had decided, without explicitly telling his family, that he would have to sell Hope End. And that is, it's an absolutely wonderful house. Annie and I have stayed there twice. It was a bed and breakfast for a time, sadly no more. But you could, and it's wonderful walks all around. It's badger country, which I like greatly. So this was the much beloved family home near Malvern, and her father decided they need to move to a smaller house elsewhere. Secondly, Hugh Stuart Boyd's lease on his nearby house was running out, and he was considering moving his family to Hastings in Sussex. Barrett was passionately committed to keeping Boyd in the neighborhood until the Barrett's own plans for moving were settled, when she hoped that Boyd and his family would move to the same area as hers. In the letter with which I'm concerned, and I began working on this, it's here at the Huntingdon, on a large project on letters, which is still ongoing, and read thousands of letters, but I got particularly fascinated by Elizabeth Barrett's, even though I had not really worked on her at all before. And this particular letter is surprisingly boring, and I just warn you about that ahead of time. The argument's going to be that it's not boring when you actually understand what's going on, but most of it is not going on in the writing at all. So that's the crucial thing. So I'll read a bit of it, which is not thrilling. You'll see, well, actually, but you do the best you can. My dearest friend. That's actually pretty shocking. I just say that. I'll come back to that. For a young woman to be writing that, a man at this period. My dearest friend, I forgot to remind you the other day of, I know, underlined twice, that my Redeemer liveth. Is that bad logic? You will recollect 100 similar passages. But my object in writing today is the correction of the information which I gave you about Hastings. Yesterday, I was mentioning to Henrietta, that's Elizabeth's sister, what I had said to you with respect to there being no trees saving the avenue very near the town. She says that there are trees besides the avenue, though I did not walk among them. She says also that the small houses are very cheap. As her testimony is at least as much to be relied upon as mine, I should feel uncomfortable in keeping it back, whatever the consequences of giving it may prove to be. I would not deceive you, even into occasioning me the greatest and indeed only happiness which it is possible for me now to possess. And I'm skipping over. Give my love to Mrs. Boyd and Annie. Ever affectionately yours, E.B. Barrett. She concludes in the blank space at the top of the page. Now that I've written the letter, it seems to me rather suicidal to send it, but I will send it notwithstanding. Although she crams in her postscript at the top of page 1, it is not because she does not have enough space on the rest of the pre-folded sheet. As you can see, pages 2 and 3 are completely blank, a point I shall return to later. And she was always capable of writing on all 4 pages, including the 4th, which contains the superscription, that's the address. So this is one, that's page 4 on the left, page 1 on the right. So I'm just showing you, and then this is page 2 and 3. So she was always capable of writing on all 4 pages, and there's no technical reason why a letter writer can't use all the available paper. But letter writers really did, and Barrett was no exception. The great majority of her letters consist not only of a single sheet of paper, but also of a sheet that consists of more blank paper than writing, or increasingly commonly in her later writings, letters written on 4 pages, but on tiny sheets of 24mo paper. So this is just to give you examples. So you can see that's one letter. That's page 1, tiny bit on page 2, page 3 blank, another letter. This is page 4, page 1 of another letter. Blank. This just shows you the size. Okay. In this evening's talk, I'm going to focus on 4 major aspects of a letter that carry a surprising range of information, quite separately from what a letter says. Choice of paper, the quantity of writing and the quantity of blank paper, postage before the penny post of 1840, which I'll explain, and the ways in which letters were sealed. So we start with paper. The first thing that Barrett had to do when she sat down to write a letter was to decide the size of paper on which she wanted to write. She lived in a wealthy family, even if they were in decline, and she could choose anything from a folio sheet to a 24mo. These are just some examples of sizes. And the size of the sheet had an important effect on how much she could write, although it certainly did not determine that. It doesn't determine. You can have a big sheet and write very little. Here, for instance, are a quarto, that's the letter underneath, and a much smaller one on top. And although the quarto sheet contains more than twice as much writing as the 16mo sheet, which is written on all 4 pages, it nevertheless consists mainly of blank paper. You can see there's twice as many words, but actually the letter on the right ends very briefly over the next page. But size was by no means the only question in her choice of paper. All her letters in the Huntington's collection, prior to the one I'm focusing on tonight, were written on what is called wove paper. And this is what we're just looking at, distinction between 2 kinds of paper. James Whatman the Elder invented wove paper in the 1750s, and it was used for the first time in John Baskerville's 1757 edition of Virgil's works. The point of wove paper was that it was much smoother than the laid paper that had been used throughout Europe for centuries. Wove paper was particularly suitable for the extraordinarily fine types that Baskerville was casting. In the 1770s, however, James Whatman the Younger started to manufacture wove paper, especially for letter writing. And by the 1820s, Barrett was usually writing on the smoother wove paper, often still made by the company that invented it, the James Whatman Company. But this leads to a curious puzzle. And so just to show you, these are watermarks. You can see that these are the watermarks dated 1827. They're backlit, so as to bring out the C. Penny, London. I can't see from where I'm seeing. So Simmons and Wynne, 1830, and then James Whatman, 1832. But this leads to a curious puzzle. By the 1830s, All the letters that I've examined by Barrett were written on wove paper, all except one. And that one is the letter that is the subject of my lecture tonight, which is on laid paper. All paper made in Europe before the late 1750s was laid paper. And it is easy to recognize because of the distinctive chain and wire lines that the mold impresses in the paper. So the chain lines are the ones that are wide apart. This is a chain line here, that's the chain line, that's the chain, and these are the wire lines, the narrow ones. And this is the only sheet of paper I've found of this kind, of this laid paper in which she's writing this period. The lines come from the mold itself, like this 1945 mold from the James Watman Turkey Mill in Kent. But if it is striking that this letter is written on laid paper, it is equally curious that the paper was manufactured in 1826, 5 years before the letter was written. Whereas usually, Barrett wrote on paper that was at most a year or 2 years old. Why did she suddenly return to this older stock of paper? The laid paper that she chose was in fact made a year before her mother's sudden death in 1827, and probably belonged to her mother. One function of the choice of paper, then, may have been to memorialize both her and her mother's happy years that they had spent at Hope End. An old letter stock, but one that materialized a lost parent, her continuing presence in all the things that she had left behind, and all that Elizabeth would be losing in leaving Hope End, including her beloved neighbor, Hugh Stuart Boyd, to whom this letter is addressed, whose proximity is, she writes, the greatest and indeed only happiness which it is possible for me now to possess. Short and long letters. How long does it have to be, Mummy? I grew up with parents who constantly lamented the decline of letter writing, reproaching themselves for not perpetuating the standards of their parents. And yet my mother, who left school at 16, wrote letters every day of her life. Indeed, my brother calculated that she wrote the equivalent of War and Peace in letters every 6 months. Here is a perfectly typical example, a letter that she wrote at the age of 82 on 8 pages with an extra half sheet for a sketch of a truck that has collapsed under the weight of the washing machines it was carrying. To grow up in such a family was, to put it mildly, a mixed blessing. But my brother and I had a very clear idea of what a real letter was. Our grandmother, a militant suffragette, was also a passionate reader of Henry James and had volumes of James's published letters in her study. Only as a research student did I finally get to see what the letters themselves looked like. It was letter writers like Henry James whose multi-sheet letters became the intimidating norm of what a real letter should be for people like my grandparents and parents. In contrast to James, my brother and I both recall the agony of thank you letters at Christmas, which my parents insisted had to fill more than a page. And we learned all the tricks of undergraduate essay writing at a very young age. Large headers and footers, wide margins, plenty of space between the lines, only a few words to a line. Mercifully, none of our letters, as far as I know, has survived. But I was delighted to discover that my own letter writing habits had been followed and preserved by a friend, Natasha Corder, who wrote to her father in 1972, "Dear Daddy, I miss you very much. Could you send me some gum? I am a advanced beginner in swimming. I can't wait until visiting day. How is your boat coming along? Do you miss me as much as I miss you? Love, Natasha." Natasha's letter is a perfect example of the short letter striving towards the visual dignity of length. The main body of the letter takes up scarcely a quarter of the first page. In other words, an eighth of the available paper, although that has already been partially filled by the presence of Charlie Brown. But having written the main body of the letter, Natasha now employs all her calligraphic resources to write in two quite different and much larger scripts the two words love and Natasha, which actually fill more than the total space of the message. The great majority of letters before the second half of the 19th century were more like Natasha Corder's than like Henry James's. Indeed, far from having a long and glorious history, the long letter is above all the invention of the 20th century, at the very same time that one starts hearing an ever louder chorus of complaints about the decline of letter writing. The reality, as American academics know all too well, is that letters of recommendation, for instance, have got ever longer. It was partly in reaction against such recommendations that some notorious British academics went to the other extreme, writing monstrosities like the following, which I quote in full. It was actually one I had to read, and you'll be glad to know the person got the job despite this. So this is the recommendation. I know nothing to the disrecommendation of this young man. That's it. That's it. We have invented a spurious history to 20th century long letter writing practices based upon a totally unrepresentative sample of a few famous men and women of letters and upon the knowledge exchanges within the Republic of Letters. And in the age of, and also the other category I would exclude is long-distance letters, that Keats, for instance, writes very long letters to his brother in America, which are really journals, but he writes short letters to everybody else. And in the age of texting and email, we should perhaps be celebrating the long shelf life of the brief letter. Recall that in German, a letter is called ein Brief, from the Latin brevis, meaning short. Barrett certainly wanted to be an exception to the general rule. She wanted to be a long letter writer. Above all, she wanted to pour out her love for Hugh Stuart Boyd. But she could not, because as I mentioned above, Boyd was blind, and his letters were read aloud to him by his wife and daughter. But she tried, with remarkably little success, it must be said, to mask at least some of the fervor of her passion, while still breaking all the usual 19th century protocols of a young woman writing to an adult man. From October 1830, she had begun addressing Boyd at the beginning of her letters as "my dearest friend." She clearly agonized about whether this was going too far, but mainly because he failed to reciprocate her attempts at intimacy, rather than because it would generally have been considered grossly inappropriate. As she wrote in her secret diary on the 22nd of October, "I have been writing to Mr. Boyd this morning. My note to him may be too expressive of regard, as his letters to me express actually none, underlined twice. I have often resolved to ice mine over also. My letter to Mr. Boyd began, 'My dearest friend.' How will his begin to me? Lord Byron used to make much ado about nothing when his friends addressed him as only 'my dear Byron.' Lord Byron was at school then, and I am not at school. Well, I cannot help it. The probability is that a certain person will write no kind of letter to me." Above all, Barrett worried that her letters to Boyd were both too long and too frequent. When it came to love, she measured passion in terms of the length and frequency of the letters that she received. If she did not, in fact, write long letters to Boyd most of the time, it was because of his letters to her and the grotesque discrepancy between them. We can trace Barrett's despair at this discrepancy through the secret diary that she began to keep in 1831. On the 28th of June of that year, she wrote, "No letters came." I think I've got that. Yes, there we go. "No letters came. Yes, one from Mrs. Boyd contained a message," underlined 4 times. "I suppose he means to neglect me altogether, never to write to me again. I wish I had half the regard which I retained for him impressed on this paper, that I might erase it thus." So she erased him. On the 5th of October, 1831, she wrote a note from Mr. Boyd. A note indeed. "Down one," underlined 3 times, "page. When will Mr. Boyd finish a letter underlined 5 times to me? And on the 25th of October, 1831, she added, if he would but write to me oftener and more at length. In fact, her agony over the disproportion between the frequency and length of their letters, and therefore of the disproportion in their loves, was not confined to the secret diary. It spilt out into the letters themselves. To February 1829. I could not help supposing that you would prefer not writing at all. 17th of May, 1832. When shall I hear from you, and how often? 13th of August, 1832. Forgive me for writing 2 long letters to you sometimes. As you say nothing to the contrary, though I have asked you about it twice or thrice, I am obliged to think that you do consider them too long. 4th of September, 1832. I did not mean to write to you so soon again. Writing so often would be worse than writing so long, as you have to pay for it. And then, at the end of October 1832, the axe fell. Boyd finally wrote to her, in a letter that does not survive, that he did indeed prefer short letters. It was a wound from which she never fully recovered, and she responded on the 2nd of November with one of the longest letters that she ever wrote, concluding, I have tried to write this letter calmly and coolly. You need not notice what I have written unless you like it. Write to me whenever it is not particularly disagreeable to you. And let me write to you as seldom and shortly as suits your real inclination. In 2 places the ink has run, probably as a result of her tears falling on the paper. We cannot know whether Barrett was really so averse to Barrett's long letters, or whether his wife and daughter finally ran out of patience with reading them aloud to him and called a stop to the proceedings. But even more than 20 years after receiving Boyd's terrible letter, that's what she called it, the terrible letter, but even after more than 20 years after receiving Boyd's terrible letter, Barrett confessed to Boyd after they'd reestablished their relationship that she had written 3 times too long a letter. And she repeatedly promises that she will, quote, not write a long letter for fear of fatiguing you. It has been widely maintained that letters prior to the 20th century were typically long. This is simply untrue. I think I said this, haven't I? Yes, I've said this already. Okay, so I need to move on. I apologize. Yeah, I said all of this. Good, I can skip that. The modern scholarly preconception that a letter composed of a single sheet of paper, yes, this is it. The modern scholarly preconception that a letter composed of a single sheet of paper pre-folded to make 4 pages will usually be written on most of the available space is entirely unwarranted and can lead to striking misunderstandings. And this is part of another aspect of my research whilst I was at the Huntington at the Art Gallery. The Huntington Art Gallery contains a painting by Richard Cosway entitled Margaret Cox, aged 14. The painting depicts a young woman, her left elbow resting on top of a letter on a table, her right hand on her knee beside a miniature hanging from her belt. The miniature is of a young, fashionable woman in a blue dress. In her excellent British paintings at the Huntington, Robin Asselson has been able to trace the actual miniature in Margaret Cox's lap. Asselson writes, fortunately, Cosway has delineated the miniature so precisely that it is possible to identify its subject as Margaret's elder sister, Mary Russell, as represented by John Smart in a miniature signed and dated 1781. So we can actually know who the painter was of the miniature, not just of the miniature and when it was painted. So we can presume, as Asselton rightly notes, that Margaret Cox is meditating upon her sister. But then, observing that the letter is composed of a bifolium of 4 pages, Asselson continues, Margaret Cox's, I've lost the place again. Margaret Cox's raised left arm physically connects the look of melancholic reverie with its source, a long letter which she has just finished reading, lying unfolded beneath her elbow. As Asselton concludes, the letter, we must assume, came from Margaret's sister, Mary Russell, and it was possibly she who commissioned Cosway to execute this sentimental double portrait, perhaps during a period of separation from her sister. The painting documents the exchange of lengthy letters and journals to keep abreast of daily events in each other's lives. But this account, and the catalogue is an excellent catalogue, and these are just mistakes we all make, but this account of the painting is simply wrong, since it does not show anything about lengthy letters and journals. To the contrary, it shows a typical letter from the period, namely a single sheet of paper pre-folded to make 4 pages, but written only on the first of 4 pages. Indeed, this particular letter is composed of a mere 9 lines, widely spaced, that do not even fill one of the 4 pages. If you go back, they're actually visible, the lines. They start here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then blank. The function of the letter in Cosway's painting, then, is not to celebrate an age of long letter writing, an age that, in my view, was largely the invention of the 20th century. To the contrary, it shows us the brevity of a typical 18th century quarto letter, written on only 1 of 4 pages. I turn now to one of the major reasons as to why the great majority of letters before the 1840 penny post, including Barrett's, were written on only a single sheet of paper, returning to the letter with which we began. So this is the only thing, and we saw already the versos are blank. If we turn to the details of the page with the superscription, that's on the left, it's a superscription. If we turn to the details of the page with the superscription, or what we now call the address, you can see a stamp in red ink. Which confusingly says Malvern Penny Post. This is confusing because it does not refer to what we now call the penny post. And crucially, and this is the absolutely important point, before 1840, it was always the recipient of a letter who had to pay for the postage, not the person who sent the letter, but the recipient. The handwritten to in black ink has been written by the post office and is the amount that Hugh Stuart Boyd will have to pay before the letter is handed over to him. What we now call the penny post was only introduced with Rowland Hall's postal reform of January 1840, nearly 9 years after this letter was posted by Barrett. After the reform, the sender, like today, paid for the post, and they paid a single penny's postage for letters to whatever part of England one was writing. Barrett welcomed this reform as, quote, the most successful revolution of her age, noting, quote, the wonderful liberty that it gave to her letter writing. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, she, like many other writers, was fully aware of and often guilty about writing letters which the recipient had to pay. On the 4th of September 1832, she concluded a letter to Boyd, I did not mean to write to you so soon again. Writing so often will be worse than writing so long, as you have to pay for it. Multi-sheet letters were uncommon before the 20th century for the simplest of reasons. One paid for postage by the sheet, regardless of weight. And to repeat, it was the recipient, not the sender, who paid for postage. In the late 18th century, William Clift sent single-sheet letters from London to his sisters in Cornwall. 6pence represented a quarter of the weekly wages of William's sisters, both of whom were in service. And William wrote to them he often placed a 6pence underneath the wax so that when his sisters received the letters and would have to pay the postage, they wouldn't be put out financially. Although William was earning considerably more than his sisters, he could not afford to waste money unnecessarily. And when Elizabeth wrote from Cornwall and he was charged for 2 sheets, he complained to both Elizabeth and to the post office. On the 10th of September 1793, William wrote to his sister, When you write, please to fold the paper as thin as you can and write single sheet at the bottom and use thin paper. William emphasized thin paper because he had been mistakenly charged for 2 sheets, and he goes on to add, I was in a sad hurry about your last letters, which you sent by the post, for they charged it double. And when I found it was single, I was forced to let it go back to the general post office in the city, where they had to look in to see if it was not double. And then they sent it back with the overcharged 6pence with J. Wilson upon it. And so I had my poor letter again. Similarly, the gardener Joseph Morton wrote to his family in the later 18th century, when you direct your letters to me, write at the bottom single sheet, as you see I have done, for the last letter was charged double postage. Writing single sheet was in fact a common practice when sending a larger than usual sheet of paper. The post office had no easy way of telling the difference between a large folio sheet and 2 quarto sheets when the letter was folded into a packet. The crucial point is that a folio sheet cost half as much to send as 2 quarto sheets, which in turn would cost half as much as 4 octavo sheets, despite the fact that the single folio sheet used exactly the same amount of paper as the 2 quarto sheets and the 4 octavo sheets. So when Lady Eleanor Butler, the elder of the ladies of Llangollen, sent a letter to Sarah Tighe in 1785 on a folio sheet, she added single sheet beneath the superscription. By contrast, John Morden wrote to his publishers on a folio sheet in 1807 and failed to write single sheet on the letter. Lackington, Allen and Co. were consequently charged for 2 sheets. When they discovered the mistake, they followed their usual practice despite the time involved. They complained to the post office and the mistake was rectified. And so it's very complicated to read all of this, but what's happened is that it should have cost 8pence. They've charged 16 pence because they thought it was, and then it's been crossed out. It says here, overcharge, and then over here, single only. So you can see the kind of complications that go on with this. In this context, a long letter meant something quite different from what it meant to Henry James. It meant using a large sheet of paper and filling up more than the first page. If the single sheet remained the norm through most of the 19th century, so did the single page. What perhaps is most staggering in EBB's correspondence, ABB is one of the ways she was often referred, Elizabeth Barrett, to Boyd, was how often she tried to follow the norm of short letters, even though, with catastrophic consequences, she was unable to restrain herself from the occasional long letter. And I have a very short coda on seals, so this is the short coda. My final section is about seals, and I put it last because I'm less interested, at least to begin with, in what seals signified to the writer before a letter was sent than what they signified to the receiver before he or she had even opened the letter and begun to read. In the First World War, one of the most dreaded figures in British daily life was the telegram deliverer. This was because telegrams were by no means common, except to announce the death of a son in the trenches or a daughter working at a hospital that had been shelled. Regular postmen have never been dreaded in quite the same way. The dread instead was carried not by the person carrying the letter, but by the color of the seal. The great majority of seals in early modern Europe were red, a convention that Barrett and her circle followed, although for reasons I don't yet understand, she occasionally also used green wax. To understand the significance of the color of the seal, I want to return again to Richard Cosway's painting of Margaret Cox. As I noted above, the Huntington Catalogue claims that the painting documents the exchange of lengthy letters and journals to keep abreast of daily events in each other's lives. I objected that the letter is in fact a typical short letter written on only one of the 4 possible pages. But I did not remark that the seal on Margaret's letter is black. In other words, this seal is not the kind of red seal on a letter to keep Margaret abreast of daily life. It is a mourning seal. And so Margaret is not meditating on an absent sister, but on a death. In a painting where one cannot read the letter, the black seal is all the more important as a signifier of death. In fact, Margaret is mourning the death of her sister, whose miniature lies in her lap. This is confirmed by a miniature that Richard Cosway himself painted in 1787, the same year as the Huntington painting. In this miniature, Margaret Cox rests her cheek against a large urn that she holds aloft. Written on the urn are the initials M.R., Mary Russell, the sister's married name, and 1786, the date of Mary's death. The urn, in other words, symbolizes the ashes of Margaret's dead sister. To read the painting, we do not need to imagine what a letter that is in any case illegible says. We need to imagine what Margaret herself would have imagined before she even opened the letter. What she would have seen is what we now see, a black seal that told her the worst before she had read a single word. Before the use of envelopes became common after the 1840s, letters were usually folded for posting and then sealed with wax. But like many other scholars, I had come to believe that there was no necessary connection between black seals and mourning, given how many black sealed letters, including the one that I've focused on tonight, make no mention of death. Barrett's letters have persuaded me that I was wrong. Most of her letters with black seals, and there are many of them, and or black-edged paper, don't mention death or mourning, for the simple fact that she used mourning seals and stationery long after the death of the person whom she was commemorating. And most of her correspondence, just like you wear mourning dress for much longer than, so you keep, as you wear mourning dress, you keep using black seals during that same period, and often black-edged paper. For instance, in a letter written to Boyd shortly after the death of her mother, she does not make any mention of her loss, but being still in official mourning, she uses both black-edged paper and a black seal. This letter was made of wove paper by the Watman Paper Factory, the founder of which invented wove paper in 1757. And the paper is watermarked 1827, the year of Elizabeth's mother's death. By contrast, in a letter that she wrote to Boyd in 1834, Barrett realizes that Boyd may have been surprised by the mourning stationery that she's used, and she adds, "The black-edged paper may make you wonder at its cause. Our dear aunt, Mrs. Butler, died last month at Dieppe." So who is Barrett mourning in her 1832 letter to Boyd? There had been no immediate death in the family, as far as I know, and most of her letters from the same period have red seals. But in this letter, I believe, she is mourning three separate losses, one in the past, the other two about to take place. The death of her mother, although it had occurred more than 2.5 years earlier, had become a newly pressing memory because of the fact that the house in which she had lived was about to be sold. In her secret diary, Barrett described her mother's death as the loss which must be a loss forever. But the loss was the more intense now because of the loss of Hope End. The second loss was precisely the loss of Hope End and the prospective move to Sidmouth, a small seaside resort on the south coast. In the process, the very name Hope End, which is on the seal, changed its meaning from being the aim and fulfillment of all Elizabeth's dreams to being the end of hope itself. The third loss was the loss of Hugh Stuart Boyd, whose proximity was, she wrote, the greatest and indeed the only happiness which it is possible for me now to possess. A piece of laid paper, some letters with too much writing on them, a black seal, the silent materializations of loves won and lost. Thank you.
So we have time for questions. Our experience in this room is that if you shout your question out, you can be heard, but we will repeat the question from the podium so that everybody can hear what's going on. Are there questions?
Yes.
I have a question about the color of the paper. Is that original, or has it turned that green color over the years?
No, that's bad photography. I don't know if you heard the question. The question is the question of the color of the paper. The problem with this, you take photographs in a place, quite rightly, like the Huntington without a flash. And so the lighting, I'm not using professional equipment or anything. I just use a handheld camera and take lots of photographs. I take tens of thousands of photographs. But the color question is, you can never be, I mean, what you should be doing is having a color chart at the side, which they do in a decent art book would do that. And, I would certainly try and get, for some of these, I'd try and get better pictures than I have. Although some of them, this is just a handheld picture. And I have to say, I'm pretty proud of that. I mean, you can actually see perfectly well, the hope end in it, the way her seal is done. You can even see the bit of paper, the jagged paper as it's torn when she opened it. But I wouldn't want to, you shouldn't rely ever upon photographs. That's one of the reasons you actually need to go to the Huntington Library to work on the originals.
I was just surprised it was green. I've never imagined that they had green paper back
They don't. They don't have. No, the green paper is just the way it appears on the screen. They did sometimes, much earlier, they did put green thing on printed books, which looks awful. I don't know why they did it. They'd put a green wash on them, particularly in England, sometimes in France. They seem to do it mainly for Bibles and books of common prayer. So I have no idea why they did that. Looks horrible.
Can I ask you, Peter, about the form of address? You alluded to the fact that she was embarrassed and regretted the fact that she'd called him or referred to him as my dearest friend.
Yeah.
What would the appropriate form of address been for a younger woman writing to an older man?
Well, she starts by saying, "Dear Sir." Right. So she begins by saying, "Dear." As she becomes more intimate with him, she says, "Dear Mr. Boyd." And then she goes through a series of steps, "My friend." But for a young woman, working with him, she was working with him and reading to him, to say, "My dearest friend," was, she knows it's shocking.
Right.
And, so it's not even a question of that period to say "my dearest friend." Right. And friend itself is a complicated word, which she also writes about. Right. And she writes at great length and says that someone has been said to be, her sister says that this other woman is her friend. She says, "My friend?" And again, she underlines it 5 times. She says, "She's not my friend." And then she says, "I only have one friend," and she means Boyd.
Right.
And so Boyd needs to be kept in that special category. It clearly has that significance of lover.
Sure.
In this context. Right. Yes.
Given Boyd's blindness, could you tell us something about how he would reply to her letters, what the mechanics?
Yes, it's an excellent question. He could write sometimes, but he very, very rarely did. In other words, he writes a dedication in a book of hers. So he'll write short things, but mainly he dictated his letters. They don't survive, so we don't know what they look like. So his letters have all disappeared.
And did he dictate them to his wife and daughter?
Yes, exactly. It'd be his wife and daughter who would... a lot of the dictation was, when he was dictating letters, a lot of his letters he dictated to Elizabeth Barrett Barrett, because she knew Greek. And most of that's what he does, he's a Greek scholar. And so he lost his eyesight relatively late, and it was a slow process. And as he was losing his eyesight, he learned vast quantities of Greek literature by heart. So he was able to he knew a lot. He was able to talk about Greek literature from memory. But nonetheless, he needed to be precise. He was working on very technical questions. And they would, Elizabeth Barrett Barrett was an extraordinarily learned woman. Even as she'd learned a range of, her Greek was excellent. And she was employed when she went to Sidmouth as a proofreader for books in Greek. That there was a genuine intellectual companionship. One of the things that irritates me about the way this story is being told is, first of all, the secret diary was only discovered very late, 1969. And by that period, everybody knew the story of Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It was one of the great romances. What people don't tell you is that when she ran away from Wimpole Street to get married, she actually went first and rested in Boyd's house. Now, he was a very old man by then, I should say that. There was no question of romance, but they did repair their relationship. I obviously couldn't get into all of this. I'm looking at this. This is the sort of bottom end when their relationship really goes belly up. But it takes 2 years to recover. And then after that 2 years, it was never the same. She's moved on in her life, and so it was never the same again. But there was a very, very genuine connection between them. Partly as scholars, partly he massively supported her marriage to Robert Browning. He knew that she needed to get away from her father, and she did.
Go ahead.
Were there various grades of ink so that some letters, the ink is preserved better?
Yes. She sometimes used a very, very faint ink that browns, and it's also a bad pen, I think, that she's got. So some of her letters are very faint indeed. It's hard to know for sure why that's the question. Sometimes it's about how they've been preserved. Lighting, obviously, can badly affect letters. If you put letters on display under bright light for exhibitions, that can cause problems. So there are, all of these things are things that conservators take into account. But it's absolutely important. And I mean, we're learning things about ink all the time. And an example of a really brilliant digitizing project is that they've digitized Montaigne's essays, which are a printed book, which he added almost as much again in the margins. And there was only a facsimile, there was only, I don't know what you call them, a black, where you reverse the colors, black on white, the writing, the type, what's the word?
Like a negative.
A negative, yeah, exactly, it's a negative, but I think there is a technical term for the actual books like this. So it's an early photocopying, it was done, and you couldn't make out anything about the ink at all. Now with the new thing, you can actually date very often the order in which he's making corrections, which turn out to be very important. For some of those, he's actually changing an idea which starts one way and then goes a different way. So I think it's a very good question. I mean, I think the ink question, it's complicated, but it tells you other things about how many writers have kind of breathings in terms of when they dip their pen. So you can actually see, the phrasing in terms, sometimes people don't care about that, but some writers really do care about that, and they'll keep going even as the ink is really running out because they want to get the whole phrase in, and then they'll dip their pen into the ink and start again. So it's just another feature of...
Just down here at the front, go ahead.
Did you learn the significance of a cut to open or a tear?
Sorry,
Did you learn the significance of a cut versus a tear to open the letter?
Oh.
No, that's a very good question. I mean,
do you want to repeat that question, Peter?
Most of these, yeah. So the question is about when do people cut letters open and when do they just tear them open? And I would say that a lot of the letters I've seen are actually like this one, torn, because the seal, you can see if it's ripped off a bit of paper with it. So I'd say that's perfectly common. Paper knives are used mainly, in my experience, for opening books, so that printed books that haven't been opened, that they would sell books at different periods, which required paper knives to open, not for a folio, but for quartos and octaves. You actually need to open the pages. And there, people would use knives, a paper knife.
Wow. Claudia.
Yeah, hi. I'm at the library curatorial department, and I just think it's interesting that we have an exhibition up now that covers our 21st century, a selection of 21st century acquisitions. And it ranges from the 15th century to the present, and it's organized thematically. And one of the sections of the show is materiality. So all sorts of materials in the collection where their physical nature really tells you something important. And it's a two-part exhibition, and part one closes this weekend. Part two opens in May, and we do in fact have a letter with mourning seal on it. So it's from the Lee family papers, and who were maternal relatives of Jane Austen.
That's wonderful. So, thank you very much. I should say one other material feature which I've been looking at is folding. And folding for me is one of the things that's really understudied. Many letters have 3 series of folding, particularly in the earlier period. So the first folding is that you fold the sheet of paper once. Someone like John Donne, when he writes a letter, he does another folding. He folds to make a margin. So there's no line, he doesn't draw a line, but he makes a margin where he'll begin to keep his writing straight. So he makes a margin by another fold, and then when he turns over, he does the same thing the other way round. So you actually end up with so as he writes, you actually see his writing getting standardized on both sides, not just because he's got 2 margins, but not on the first page. So they've got 1 margin on the first page. I'm not explaining this very well, but anyway, I'd have to show you to see. So that's one thing. But the other thing I've been working on is diamond folds. And Mary Shelley writes, you actually see this emerging in the 17th century. You see it in Dutch paintings. So diamond folds, you fold to make these diamond shapes, mean just what it means today. Diamonds are forever. They're love letters. And that Mary Shelley writes a love letter to a woman who they'd fallen out with. I mean, it's a complicated story. It's not a sexual love letter, but it's certainly a love letter, and that they'd fallen out, and her friend had been totally offended by her because of how she'd been addressed, the salutation. So the salutation was, we don't know what it was. She just says, I really didn't want to upset you. And then does this, it's very fulsome, but she's folded it to make this diamond pattern. And that to me is the most significant thing in the whole letter. She's saying our friendship will survive. And one of the letters that Elizabeth Barrett sends to Boyd is in a diamond pattern. So that might be interesting to think about for these sorts of questions, right? How again, and this has become very popular, I gather, again amongst certain kids. Kids started doing this at schools. Messages they pass around the classroom with very complicated folding patterns. So it hasn't completely disappeared.
Yeah. We've talked about the materiality of paper, and we've talked about the materiality of ink. What about the materiality of writing implements?
Yeah, I mean, it's another. I mean, I obviously had to select out of all of these things. Another really fascinating question, is what. I mean, I'm doing a lot of work at the moment on Emily Dickinson because I'm teaching at Yale, and they have some of her materials there. But also where Annie and I live, we live in Amherst, just north of Amherst, and a lot of Emily Dickinson's work is at Amherst College. And what you see there is all this late work is in graphite, and it's not just in graphite. She's writing nearly only on envelopes. So this is on envelopes that have been sent to her. So they're odd shapes and so on. And a fabulous book has come out about this, which I strongly recommend. It's called The Gorgeous Nothings. The Gorgeous Nothings. It's a quote from her. But The Gorgeous Nothings is a kind of double erasure that she's staging in her own poetry. It's a reduction to these scraps of paper, and then graphite, which is erasable. And so it's a deliberate attempt not to make a claim, you might say. It's a distancing from what she was doing earlier in her life when she was writing in ink and then sewing together the fascicles. So she actually sewed the fascicles together. And this is completely different. So why they survived at all is miraculous. But it goes along, in my view, with she made a herbarium when she was a teenager. And this is a kind of herbarium. It's become a herbarium through this fabulous book, The Gorgeous Nothings, where they've gathered together all these little, fabulous bits and pieces. Yes.
We've got time for a couple more. Go ahead.
Could you please tell us more about the secret diary, and is it possible to tell when the pages were ripped out?
So the question.
There's a good. I mean, I've never seen it, so I just have to say that. I mean, there's a modern edition of it when it came out, so I know the modern edition. And it does claim, I don't know what the evidence for this is, that the ripping out was done late, possibly, maybe even the 20th century. So what amazes me is, given that bits were ripped out, how much survives. In other words, that you can see from the things I showed you. This is not unclear, to me at any rate, that this is a passionate relationship. I mean, this is someone who's heartbroken a lot of the time. And, that to say this is the big thing in my life, the only thing that makes me survive, now my mother's dead, is this. And, it's many, many things. It's multi-layered. It's certainly an intellectual relationship. It's a relationship about Greek. He appreciates her poetry. She can read her poetry to him. So it's about being loved or feeling loved. At the same time, it's incredibly complicated and made unbelievably complicated because of his blindness. I mean, you come back to this blindness and the notion that everything, all the letters have to be mediated. And so what staggers me is how actually open she is in some of these letters. I mean, that's what really staggers me, that she doesn't really disguise very much. But of course, it's only in the secret diaries you get this outpouring. And particularly that all these other things, these features, the underlinings, which I wish I could see the original, because then I could actually capture, I'd love to have photographs of this. I want to see the things 5 times underlined. And the exclamation marks, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, I mean, this isn't how she writes her letters. So her letters are much more, restrained than that. But this is a sort of overflowing of extraordinary exclamation marks.
And we'll finish with the question at the front. Yeah, go ahead.
But he kept her letters, so he must have
Yes.
had some feeling for her.
Oh, yes.
He did not keep his.
Do you want to?
Oh, yes. No, the last thing I'm saying is that he didn't have any feelings. I mean, we don't know what happened, whether she didn't keep his letters or not. She may have kept them, she may not have kept them. It may be that at a certain point
She burned them?
she gave them back to him because they became friends again, you know. But she also moved on, you know, she did move on. There wasn't such a reason. Whereas for him, you know, she was becoming a very famous poet, one of the great poets of the 19th century. And so, you know, certainly he was extremely proud, increasingly proud, that he was one of the people who really discovered her. You know, he'd actually more than discovered her. He'd been a mentor. He'd taken her seriously. He believed that she was an important Greek scholar. He loved her poetry. He loved her poetry. So, you know, there was. I mean, the last thing I'm saying is that we really don't know his side of the story because nothing survives, and because everything anyway had to be mediated at the textual level through the mother. And I do wonder sometimes, I mean, what would it be like to know what the mother, if the mother and daughter had kept an account of this?
Yes,
that would be pretty weird.
On that speculative note, we will conclude. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your consistent support of our programmes. Please join us outside for coffee and cookies, and please join me in thanking Peter Stallybrass.